And we're going to go back to the international legal framework, both to sort of recap and synthesize some of what we've already covered and think a little bit about this problem of American exceptionalism and Christian nationalism that I named. So the goal is respect for human rights, and one mechanism for accountability and pursuit of this goal is this international legal framework, the special body of international law that's developed over the last 70 years to support and advance human rights. So we started with the 1948 Universal Declaration as the constitution of the human rights movement, the cornerstone of human rights law. We reflected, well, actually, this is a new point that I want to bring in. I don't think I mentioned this before. The rise of human rights law is noteworthy because it represents a shift in the understanding of territorial sovereignty of the nation state. What do I mean by that? I mean, before this point, the way a country treated its own nationals would not have been an issue that other countries had authority to weigh in on or to critique. So Philonis Floyd testifying in Geneva before world leaders about how his brother was treated on the streets of Minneapolis, that phenomenon, that ability to appeal beyond one's own government, that only comes with the rise of international human rights law. And it constrains the nation state. It constrains, let's say, the US government by saying there are limits. There are standards and norms for how you treat even your own citizens. The state, the government has a responsibility to respect, protect human rights, even to promote and fulfill, to ensure that all people can enjoy basic human rights on a basis of equality and non-discrimination. We talked about human rights treaty agreements. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide, but these are sort of additional legal mechanisms countries can join, and in joining, they are making voluntary promises to respect and uphold certain human rights. For instance, the US is part of a treaty on eliminating racial discrimination, and that's one mechanism of accountability for the problem of racially disparate police force. We spoke of the Human Rights Council. In fact, you saw Philonis Floyd testify before the Human Rights Council. There was also some news within the last week. On February 10th, there was a press release following up on that process that we witnessed that began there with Philonis Floyd's testimony. So the process of UN investigation of the problem of racialized policing continues. And in fact, UN experts sought information on the death of Tyree Nichols in Memphis and Keenan Anderson in Los Angeles. They cited the right to life, the right to be free from torture or cruel or unusual punishment. And they reiterated US responsibility to investigate, to prosecute, and punish violations of these rights. So just another example unfolding in real time of how this international legal system is relevant to the injustices that we witness unfolding and continuing to this day. And then finally, we talked last time about the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It's a regional body, so it's applicable to the Americas. and relevant to the United States because we're part of a treaty, the Organization of American States. And we looked both at the report that this body had produced on racialized policing, and we saw that Jessica Lenahan was able to take her case before this commission, which reached a different result, which offered her a measure of justice after the US Supreme Court had failed to do so. One more picture for you about the international legal framework. Again, well, you can tell I never met a diagram I didn't love, so I'm a visual person. This is a simple diagram, but it shows you how we could think of three levels of human rights norms or principles. We could think of the international level at the top, human rights treaties, or even the Universal Declaration, these global agreed upon norms, which then inform the reform process for national constitutions and consequently statutory law at the national level. So every constitution adopted post-World War II reflects the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in important ways. And those principles have also been cited in pursuing constitutional reform. Now, in the time that we have remaining, we're going to turn to briefly another challenge to the realization of human rights, and then we're going to look at a reform effort that we've been involved in at Justice Revival. First, the challenge, the problem of American exceptionalism. And if we were together, I'd ask, if people were familiar with this term. I'm going to be speaking based on a book by Michael Ignatieff. It's called American Exceptionalism in Human Rights from 2005. And Ignatieff describes what many have observed. He calls it a unique pattern of both leadership and resistance. Says the US is both a leader on human rights and an outlier, saying that the US in some ways has displayed exemplary leadership, was very involved in promulgating the Universal Declaration. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was at the helm of the 18-nation committee that drafted the Universal Declaration. Most human rights treaties, the US is closely involved in negotiating. But that doesn't mean the US then joins the treaties. In fact, as I shared with you last time, the US is classically resistant to do so. So it has joined 3 important human rights treaties out of 9. And even when the US joins human rights treaties, it tends to do so with these caveats or carve-outs. They're called RUDs, reservations, understandings, and declarations for those who are on the legal side. But this can essentially sort of limit the commitment the US is making to respecting what's already in US law. And so there's a real sort of both a presumption of leadership. There's this kind of American ideal that maybe human rights are simply exporting what we have in our Constitution. And at the same time, there's a resistance to accountability. So in this entire book on this subject, and I think it's an edited collection, but in Ignatieff's introduction, he even describes what he calls a messianic vision. So I thought this was interesting to pull out, saying presidents across the political spectrum have articulated this messianic vision of the US role promoting human rights. Now, he was writing in, I think, 2005. So this was clearly before Donald Trump, who departed entirely from this pattern. But he's recognizing that this sort of U.S. presumption of leadership on human rights is related to, he relates it to a kind of a missionary conviction that American values have universal significance and application. At the same time, however, there's a deeply partisan divide, and there was even 15 years ago, which prevents progress on human rights. One piece of legislation that we see a big partisan divide on today is the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. So the legal reform that was advanced, I think since as early as 2001 to address the lethal use of force against people of color in particular, but that legislation has not gained bipartisan support. So there is a challenge of partisanship. There is a challenge, Ignatia finds, of active, vocal, committed, conservative opposition. And here it comes, the most vocal, influential, well-resourced groups in the opposition tend to be groups on the Christian right. Scholars in his book document. So you don't need to take my word for it. So including Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism. We've heard a lot about Christian nationalism since January 6th. You may know that it represents a conflation of American and Christian identities, a fusion of religious and civic life. From a faith perspective, it's a concern because it comes with great potential for idolatry, elevating the nation state as sort of an alternative faith or a component of religious faith. From a democratic perspective, it's problematic in its associations with authoritarianism, its demands for cultural assimilation, often associated with racism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, as well as close associations with defense of a patriarchal order and fixed gender roles. So we could do certainly a whole session on Christian nationalism. If you haven't listened to the podcast that the Baptist Joint Committee did, I highly recommend that. And there's a campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, that Justice Revival has long supported. It's led by BJC and others, and that's going to be in the resources that I share with you. Okay, back to Christian nationalism, I've suggested, is a key opposition force that threatens to thwart progress on human rights because the ideologies are diametrically opposed. You see, on the one hand, a respect for human rights as a universal standard of just treatment of all people on a basis of equality, regardless of any criteria or any facet of identity. On the other hand, a nationalist idea of America first, or even a Christian nationalist idea that it's only white Eurocentric Christians that are truly American. This is clearly, problematic for a whole host of reasons, but it doesn't, it just doesn't cohere at all with a commitment to respect for human rights, or for that matter, for constitutional rights on a legitimate basis in a democratic society. So movement for a multicultural democracy, movements for racial and gender equality, these movements are cutting against this nationalist force. And what I want to suggest to you is that a commitment to human rights as a person of faith is a powerful counter-testimony against this rising problem of white Christian nationalism we see in the United States today. That's just one reason why, for me, as an advocate, it is so important to speak out for human rights and to say that I do that as a person of Christian faith, not despite, but because of my faith. So throughout this workshop, we've talked about bases for human rights that can be found in Christian faith, the love of God given equally and permanently, the sacredness of human life reflected in Christian and Hebrew scriptures, the solidarity of Christ with humankind, the self-giving, unconditional love. To me, these are deep and firm foundations for human rights. These are reasons I support human rights. I don't think they're the only reasons that someone can come to a commitment to human rights, but it's important for me to use my voice as a Christian, in part because I see that there's a dangerous message out there that says America first, that says white Eurocentric Christianity should be privileged. And that's not what my faith has led me to believe. That's not what I believe as an American who values the US Constitution.